All right. So, Matt, it looks like people are logging in, and you ready to start?
I'm all set, Mike.
All right, terrific. So, I want to just welcome everybody to today's episode, I guess you could say, of our interactive dialogue series. A couple of housekeeping thoughts just as we're starting up the program here. First is that you have the materials. They're sent as a link attached to the reminder email that was sent yesterday. So if you have any information that you'd like on the slides themselves, then you should have those already in your email. We will be answering questions, and so I commend to you the chat feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure now in Zoom land, we're all familiar with where that is. Just send me a chat. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll do my best to either answer the questions directly or weave them into the presentation. I'll also keep them anonymous to the best extent possible. If you have a confidential question, then please just mark it as confidential, and I'll make sure not to mention your name or any part of your name or company or the like. And then finally, and I'll say this again at the end, we'll be announcing a CLE code about midway through, and there is continuing education credit for lawyers that's attached to this program. So you can get that as we go into the presentation. So the interactive dialogue series really started with the idea of trying to kind of take the typical lawyer presentation, which is 75 slides with lots of text to them, and shove them into the internet for an hour as much as you can, and basically read the slides into the computer. And this is a different way of thinking. What we've done is we've taken a singular topic and we tried to discuss it in a more interactive way and tee up some of the major issues that one faces in the topic, and then identify and interview an expert like Matt today about that particular topic. So this is a unique one. It's the first time we've done a series of presentations. Today's is the third in a three-part series on mergers and acquisitions in the food industry. However, for those who are listening who are not in the food industry, all of the information in each of the three programs is directly applicable to really any industry. So it's not unique to food, beverages, agribusiness, or cooperatives, or the like. The first presentation was on best practices for pre-sale preparation. We hosted that with George Sent, who's the managing director in charge of the food and beverages practice at Cascadia Capital. And George gave great information about best practices that companies can engage in before they put themselves on the market to really enhance the value that the company might seek to achieve in a merger, acquisition, or other kind of financing. Our second program was hosted with Morgan Helm. Morgan is an attorney in our Minneapolis office, is the deputy chair of the food and beverages practice at Dorsey. And she went through the deal timeline and process, and ended with the admonition that don't forget, you're buying this company and you'll have to run it as soon as the closing happens. She reported that she had one deal where she made that comment towards the very, very end of the process, and the buyer said, well, wait, you mean I have to actually run the plant when it's all done? And she said, yes, on Monday it's yours and you need to run it. Well, wait a minute, like we need to delay everything because we're not ready for that yet. So in any event, today is just be great, Matt. I'm so grateful that you're here because really it's closing the circle. If you think about what were the things that George said in the first series that one ought to do to achieve the synergies and strategy that this combination of companies can provide. And then Morgan said, okay, let's make sure we understand what we're buying, that you really have a good sense of it, you have the information that you need to run this company and integrate them well. And then today we're going to be talking about the important impact of how to integrate. So Matt, with that as the kind of tee up, can you give a brief summary of your own background?
Sure thing, Mike. I mean, and I think that's a great segue for what we're going to talk about today, of someone kind of being caught off guard of not being ready day one to integrate the business and have the business actually be put together. I'm Assistant General Counsel for M&A and Ventures at Land O'Lakes, Inc. I've been at Land O'Lakes for almost 6 years now, being essentially the lead M&A attorney for all of the deals we do here since I started. I was at Dorsey for the 8 years prior to my time here at Land O'Lakes, where I learned to do these deals. And I have a few other roles at Land O'Lakes, but primarily on the M&A and Ventures and our finance department.
Fantastic. So as the person who's managing the merger and acquisition process for really one of the leading companies, especially in the food and agribusiness industry, but even more broadly than that for sure. So glad you're here today. And a little bit of a reminder for those who may not have listened to the earlier programs, they are all on dorsey.com. But a little bit of information about why did we pick this topic, and then we'll dive into it, into the process. So this slide comes from the first presentation, and it's fascinating, honestly, now to look at it again here at the end of June when our presentation series started back in March, and the decision about it really was in the early part of the year. And boy, doubling down on what we predicted at the time. First, the markets are just extremely active. It's really extraordinary. There's a genuinely and generally held belief that $3 in 2021 would be $4 in 2022. That is a different way of saying that capital gains tax changes that are predicted to occur will have a significant impact on the net value that is achieved. And that's a pretty universal belief that's driving decision making. And I say that because whether that belief is true, whether it's valid, et cetera, is really irrelevant. It is believed. And so that is definitely driving some of the decision making we're seeing. For those, especially on the executive level, who had survived the Great Recession, COVID, the dot-com, et cetera, and now COVID, many executives are thinking, "Wow, I'm just tapped out," and now's the time. I might have thought maybe in 5 years, but it feels like I lived 5 years just in 2021 and 2020 alone. And then also there's a lot of money still sloshing around through strategic investors, private equity funds, and the like. There's activity and interest in acquiring, and the food space in particular is one of those where they're not growing more agricultural land and the like, and people still need to eat. And then also we included this slide from the last presentation in which Morgan Helm described the deal timeline process and examples. And I want to just emphasize, maybe a little bit of an obvious observation on this slide, but if you look at the moderately aggressive timeline, where there'd be a early stage letter of intent, already marketed the company, and then you get to a closing about 6 months later. If you're not already in that process, then it might be too late for 2021. I say that, excuse me, recognizing that we also have an aggressive timeline at the top. But one of the things that we're finding in the merger and acquisition process right now is that things are really bunched up, and it's becoming more difficult to find key providers of certain things, whether it's a lawyer, an accountant, tax opinions, real estate transfers and such. Just getting people's attention, because there's so much in the pipeline right now, is becoming an interesting time. So if you're not on it yet, you better have that be an objective by the end of next week. So, all right. So with that as kind of a lead up to this presentation, I wanted to kind of start off with some definitions, Matt. And we talk about the idea of integration. What does that mean from your perspective?
Well, for us, Mike, I mean, as a strategic acquirer and strategic partner in joint ventures, integration for us is often about actually combining the target business with either a division of our business or otherwise really closely aligning it with our business, as opposed to something that's more of a on the private equity side where you're just kind of stepping into it. Often the deals that we do are not plug and play, so you have to actually take every system in the target business and make sure that it's going to work smoothly with our existing business that we're plugging it into. So it's, all of the property and the people and the systems, putting it together, and overall, looking from start to finish, start looking at the supply chain of the target business all the way to its customers, and how do we make sure that on day one that business is working fairly seamlessly with our business.
And so you're kind of indicating that the integration process doesn't start on closing. It starts at some point before that, right?
It does. And I most successfully, I've seen it start, even before we've signed a letter of intent, or right, soon after a letter of intent, where you're actually talking about the nuts and bolts of putting the business together. Once you have that initial kind of commitment under a letter of intent. So I think it's the earlier the integration starts, and of course it will be a matter of degree. It's high level integration from the outset, but certainly before the agreement is even signed, Mike, we often start our integration process.
So you reference the wide-ranging planning and problem solving. What would be some examples of the kind of planning or the kind of problem solving that one might want to do in this leading up to a close?
Well, we have, like I said, we're being a strategic acquirer. We're in the food agribusiness discussion here, so it's a lot of the manufacturing discussions of thinking about where does the target company get its ingredients? Are those all coming from the same place? Are we planning to expand the manufacturing capacity? Where are the employees? Are all the employees sticking around? Are they on their benefits day one? Distribution, are we utilizing the same distribution chain? Customers need to see, day one, we want the customers. It's often a big key for the business of the customers, seeing the right face on day one, and knowing, not being caught off guard, and knowing what's happening. So the more smoothly integration can happen day one, and without a lot of things will be happening in a transition post-close, the typically more successful the business will be.
It's fascinating. I'm reminded of the last presentation by Morgan, where we talked about how typically, at least in the early stages, the deal team is very small. And that what you're really describing, though, is much broader. It's truly kind of getting in and rolling up your sleeves to understand the business. Just even the idea, for example, of supply chain, you'd have to think, do we already have contracts with those suppliers? Which one is preferred? Is that going to change our deal structure? Are those the kinds of things that you'd be looking at for in the, especially as you get closer to close?
Absolutely. The business is trying to sniff out all the synergies and then be able to capitalize on those synergies. So you're looking at efficiencies along those lines, but you're also especially on the legal side, we're trying to minimize surprises later in the process. And so the more, to the extent you're able to ask those questions and look in all the nooks and crannies for surprises early on, and the fewer surprises you'll have later. And in terms of the team, you're right. We keep a small team early on for purposes of confidentiality, but we found here it's always good to get someone who's the top of the supply chain, or a lieutenant in the supply chain team on our side, to be looking at supply chain issues at the target and thinking about those things earlier so that we can plan. And even though we won't have all the information that we'll need from the target, of course, early stages diligence has just begun. It's great to tee up what those questions are so that we can start our planning. So the team will evolve, it sounds like, and there's not like a tranche where all of a sudden you add 5 people. It's more like, we're going to pull this person, and then the next, and the next, and so on. Is that how it works? Yeah, typically you see it kind of go down the chain as the deal ages. More and more people are involved, and you'd be surprised because you bring in, as people lower in the chain come in, they have their own specific aspect of any particular process that they're thinking about, and there will be, you can't avoid all the surprises. And I mean, it's a benefit that I have, or, you know, as in-house counsel, Mike, it's a benefit that I have where I have access to people below, you know, just the CFO and the C-suite folks that I can talk to a VP in the supply chain, or in manufacturing, or in quality control, and I'm we're having integration team meetings and talking through those things early on, and it's a good perspective on the legal side of things, that even if they're not making it into the purchase agreement, we know there are aspects of the process that have to be addressed, and sometimes they do make it into the purchase agreement.
You know, and it struck me as well that you also have the benefit of some volume. So you've seen 4 deals like this in the last 2 years, and so you kind of know, okay, we're going to need to pull IT in really early because that was an issue before, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's iterative learning process of the types of things to even ask about the IT, or about any of the various processes. Something 10 years ago that I would have never thought of is that you might have certain, and obviously it's specific to the business, but there's some software, like for us, we need the formulation software at a specific manufacturing facility to speak the same language as a procurement software, maybe at that HQ that's like an enterprise software, but not all the facilities. That we don't have one unitary clean IT system that goes across the country at all of our facilities, and so a particular facility has particular formulation software or quality software of some kind, and it needs to talk to the other enterprise software that does the procurement or otherwise. So it's things like that, which that then again we're deep into like maybe there's a carve out deal that we're doing where we're not taking one whole system of IT that's going to be a plug and play on day one. So that colors a lot of the way I think about where the risks are.
You mentioned here strong assist from legal. What do you mean by strong assist?
Strong assist, I mean, it's kind of, if the business development team is sitting in chair 1, I think legal is often sitting in chair 1A, and not kind of just being in their legal, not being in the legal role. I think the legal is kind of oftentimes playing quarterback with the business development team and trying to see the whole field. And so I think that's what I'm trying to imply there with the strong assist is pretty heavy involvement from the legal team, because again, we're looking legal is start to finish in the process, and for in-house teams we're around for far beyond the closing, and so our assistant is pretty critical.
Now, a question just mostly from your experience before going in-house to Land O'Lakes, where many of the people who are participating, I noticed, are from companies where they either don't have an inside legal department, presumably don't have the inside business development group, which usually, if it's an external provider, you call that person a investment banker, right? And so how does that coordination work when you've got those 3 parties, I guess, one, the business, obviously the most important party, and then the 2 outside providers?
Right, and on some deals you won't necessarily have the investment banker either, and certainly at Dorsey, I did plenty of transactions where it was an in-house business team that wasn't really a business development team, that was more just an operational team that had to kind of strap on their tool belt for a deal like this. And that's absolutely where a ton of value can be added by the external counsel, throwing some people at it, doing some of this, helping the business think through some of this planning. I mean, the business has the information, they just need some of the language and some of the organizational practice to be able to pull this off. So it's a much leaner team in that situation. And we run a fairly lean, we have a lean business development team here as well, Mike. But when that's the case, it's just a matter of, outside counsel to the extent you can, and oftentimes you'll still only have one contact point, of course, at the client, and then depending on giving them the tools to go out and compile the data from inside the business, and then going to the target as well and kind of doing the same thing. So that's the lift.
One of the things I found surprisingly effective is the very old school conference call with literally a conference bridge line, not even Zoom. And just to keep the cadence up. And it's funny, I have actually a taxonomy of meetings, believe it or not, that there are only so many reasons that you have a meeting and to convey information, gather information, make a decision, or social. And I found that a very short, 30-minute, once a week or twice a week phone call, just to get everybody focused on, wait, this is really happening, it's very important, can be a good kind of skeleton to keep the deal team focused. Was that your experience as well?
I agree. I think that's one of the keys to getting the integration right, is to having a cadence and having frequent meetings. As we saw on the slide of the deal timeline, these things can drag out, and folks, at the business have plenty of other stuff to do. We all have plenty of other stuff to do, and things can kind of languish a bit, and then you can find yourself playing catch up. So I think depending on the stage of the deal, a weekly call, bi-weekly call, internal calls and all sides calls, and keeping those going are going to allow you to stay on top of everything and not let a particular transaction be pushed to the back burner, where issues don't get resolved. And I find, Mike, we were talking before about a lot of the keys, especially on the legal side, are, let's not let the client get surprised by anything, and like you said, have to delay a transaction, where the closing timelines are absolutely key. So to avoid delays, those calls are important, because if you have a weekly or bi-weekly call, somebody can't wait on something for 3 weeks to get an answer. And it's really a game of compiling the information and planning. And so what you have to do if when you fall behind like that, oftentimes I see good planning be sacrificed, right? And then you get caught with surprises.
We had a summary on that slide as well about legal risks, but many of those are anticipating the legal risks that can happen post-closing, and either trying to contract around it or anticipate. I think one that I find particularly important is understanding the nature of consents and transfer limitations, assignment clauses, and the like. And one of those that sometimes surprises the business executives is that the standards of law actually change for intellectual property licenses. So whereas general contracts are in most jurisdictions deemed transferable unless the agreement restricts them, with IT licenses, the opposite is true. It's deemed that you need to have a consent to the assignment. And I thought it was just interesting that when I asked, what are some of the bigger challenges, perhaps no surprise, your example was directly IT related, of looking at procurement software and will it talk to our procurement software, and et cetera. Can you describe briefly the post-transaction challenges that you find are the biggest roadblocks that might surprise somebody?
Yeah, and I think we have a good list going here. We've talked about IT a bit, and that's a good one, Mike, and just in terms of assigning IT, and just the number of different IT vendors that a typical business is going to have makes it challenging. And so on the legal side, there's all the contractual obligations can be a morass as well, and not to mention some of the business issues I was talking about of actually having all of the IT talk to each other on day one, so that orders can be taken and procurement can go along smoothly.
You mentioned when we were prepping that you were surprised that benefit plans can wag the dog. What did you mean by that?
Right. Well, it's, the employees, of course, it's a very sensitive part of the business, keeping people happy. And it's a stressful, even if the employees are kind of excited about a change, it's still a very stressful time in the life of an employee. And so and also, just the benefits field being, it's a complicated niche sector, and it's rules that are not necessarily intuitive. So it's important, and it's important for the employees that everything day one is how they've been kind of told that it will be in terms of the transition. And so for timing, I've seen deals be completely rerouted for timing because of employee concerns around not wanting to have to issue 2 W-2s or have folks deductible start over or things like that, as a practitioner, you're not thinking about those as the high level issues, but for the number of people at the target company that they can affect, they do end up, it's probably, from my seat, it's fair to call it wagging the dog, but for people who have to run this business on day one, it's the dog. And so,
it's fascinating. Literally on Friday, I was talking to somebody about a topic related in a way, where they had acquired some businesses, and for whatever reason, the payroll systems just didn't sync up. And that was a bit of an IT issue, but the result of it was that they had not paid people properly. And it just, not only the absence of the payment, but also the fix, which didn't really fix it, which then they had to do a triple fix. And they just kind of, through no fault of anybody, were bumbling around. And it caused all kinds of ripple effects. It caused employee problems. So a few lawsuits were filed, labor issues with labor unions, challenges with management as far as the perceived competence of the company. It just everything. So.
Yeah, precisely. That's a perfect example, Mike. It hits the IT issue as well, but it affects the employees, and how important is it to get to, for a lot of employees to have their paycheck hit the day it's supposed to hit. And it's something that if it, given due attention, that it shouldn't be, it's not the most complicated issue. It's a logistical issue. So getting out ahead of it is the type of thing.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned culture twice too on this slide. Can you describe how that can be a post-transaction challenge?
Yeah, and I think, it kind of goes to the example you just gave, Mike, right? Of, where the new ownership is coming in, and you want to have a good first impression with employees and with any management that's sticking around at the target. And in a pre-COVID world, it was always, I thought it was great on deals where we were able to have some in-person meetings with the employees on day one, and I've seen our company and other clients go the extra mile and have new personnel in across the country at different locations, and having a big teleconference among the various sites to kind of welcome everybody and just get off on the right foot. Trying to understand the culture of a target before you buy it is difficult as well, but I've seen effort be put in to do that in the diligence side, which is not something you usually see in the legal due diligence checklist of trying to get to the bottom of the culture. But it's important, I think, for integrating and on both sides of, like I said, showing kind of the best version of the acquirer's culture as well.
I had an interesting example of that many years ago, where it was a business fairly small comparative to the size that many of the deals you've worked on, but the CEO of the acquiring company, the buyer, came in and had a meeting with all the key management team of the company that they were buying, and had memorized the seating chart and pictures, and called each person out by their first name. It was, a bit of a party trick, honestly, but an amazing one. And it said, Matt, this is why you're important. And, John and Sally and all the various people who were there at the company. And I thought, what an interesting way to really approach, because there's always a fear, I would think. And, by walking the culture talk is critical.
Absolutely.
And then the next bullet point talks about effecting the assignments and consents. Why would that be a post-transaction challenge?
Well, I think it's this one also sits on both sides of the fence of obtaining the third-party consents to all the assignments is a big there's a big diligence effort there, and then also just executing on closing to get the consents but it's also an integration issue, just because like we talked about, Mike, it's these consents are from important suppliers and important customers and important IT vendors, and so making sure that those relationships are working the same way on day one that they need to, and not having needless kinds of interruptions that make everybody question the relationship, is plenty important as well. And in the oftentimes with those important customers or suppliers, we're having businesses, someone from the business, there's a relationship contact, and maybe there's someone else representing the business to sit with some of those, to talk with some of those parties, either probably day one or T-1, something like that, to assure all interested parties that we're here to support this new business and take care of this relationship.
So knowing that you obviously now work in-house for Land O'Lakes, and had, I think, worked on transactions for Land O'Lakes as an outside lawyer as well, right?
Yep, correct. I did a handful of Land O'Lakes transactions before coming over.
So I want to ask you the question I always ask somebody in your situation, and that is, knowing what you know now on the inside as essentially the client, but also working on the legal team. Kind of what would you do differently as an outside lawyer for the many outside lawyers listening in? Or maybe what would you do the same but more of it, that kind of thing?
Yeah, probably on the, a lot of the same but more of it. And oddly, Mike, when there was a big transaction for Land O'Lakes that we signed my last day at Land O'Lakes, and then closed. Did two closings at Land O'Lakes once I came in house, and so I had that deal in particular where I was able to was able to see both sides of it, where we'd set that deal up entirely and signed it as external, and then closed it and did everything external. It was a special transaction in some ways that made it even, that was, like I said, it had the two closings, it had this very long period between closings, but certainly some lessons to be learned in terms of what to do as outside counsel versus inside counsel. And a lot of it would kind of, to things we've talked about trying to investigate a little bit deeper into some of the business drivers that are going on, and with the particular transaction, and understanding some more of the, like the supply chain to customer network that I mentioned before. And that I know, time is precious, and you don't always want to bring an outside lawyer on every call either, but the more you can give the outside lawyers a peek into some of the business integration planning in particular, is helpful. I would say, like on this one particular, that deal, and plenty of other deals where I've seen a similar thing, if you can understand some of the assumptions in the business model that that the business has put together to justify buying or merging or doing this deal. There are underlying assumptions in the model, and oftentimes those are, well, can we hit the growth and add new customers and expand and that kind of thing. But sometimes as well, they're about assumptions about certain costs, and those can often be affected in, via legal structures, or kind of quasi structures that you're building into the deal to make sure that a business is following some of the assumptions. For instance, like a deal where there were pretty strict distribution cost expectations, but our warehousing team was planning to just sign up a warehouse lease because it would have been great and convenient to just have another warehouse space across the street. And we kind of sniffed that out and said, well, if we sign up that warehouse lease, we're going to blow up the model, because that extra warehouse cost was not planned into the model. So it's things like that, where I think just investigating the drivers of the business model are very useful for outside counsel.
And ultimately, it's the roadmap for what questions to ask, right?
Exactly.
So the people that you're asking are those who are on the integration team, and we listed out kind of some of the key various members of that team. Can you walk through an example of the kinds of business professionals that you want as you're integrating?
Yeah, and we talked, Mike, about some sensitivity around the size of the team, and so as much as possible, keeping the team, pretty small from the early stage. But here we go. Real estate jumps out to me as a long tail. Often, when there's property involved, and even if it's leased property, but especially owned property, as we've all kind of seen real estate delay deals if you're acquiring really old property that has issues. And real estate is kind of a closely related to environmental health and safety, which is also an important one. We had we did a deal where we had to decommission an airport that was right next to a dairy facility that we acquired, which we had thankfully kind of uncovered early enough, because we knew we needed to do an expansion on a project to make it, to support the deal assumptions. But the expansion would have been a problem, because airplanes would have been flying too close to it for the aviation regs.
Yeah, how do you get it commissioning? I mean, I didn't even know that was possible.
Right. So we ended up having to decommission this. It was kind of it was a small airport that it was named after a local hero, so it was especially, I think, heartbreaking for folks, the municipal team, to decommission it. But it's it was a real estate EH&S thing, where it was a lot of important groups that kind of, and I knew the airport was there, and I knew there were going to be issues, but without having some of these experts involved. Accounting and finance is an obvious one, and HR we kind of talked about. The insurance risk management team, I find that they're really useful to think about. They're also oftentimes seeing the whole field of, our risk managers as well, and capturing some synergies, and good folks to have in. And then I've got, some deal specific groups. I mentioned quality control before, which can be key. Manufacturing, sometimes we'll be acquiring a business where we've got to find space in our existing manufacturing footprint, or make some changes on the manufacturing side at a facility that we're buying. Sales and marketing can often be important.
I had one in the sales and marketing department, just by way of example. A lot of times you're looking here at what are the choke points or bottlenecks in the process from getting the supply in, manufacturing whatever your value add is, and then selling. And in this example, it was a customs control issue, where by changing the name or changing the potential supplier, it had already been approved in various countries around the world. And so that changed the potential deal structure pretty significantly. And that would not have been noted if it weren't for the fact that somebody in that department was involved in the integration team comparatively early on.
Right. I mean, we've got a ton of talented, creative people up and down the organization, which which all companies do, and it's good to be able to leverage that, and they have expertise that legal folks don't, or they're seeing something that someone up the chain from them is not seeing.
So I had a couple of interesting questions from attendees, and one of which I think is pertinent here. Shelley asked a question about how, in looking at aligning cultures post-close, have you had situations where the desire was to maintain the separate nature of the company and maintain its own culture, not necessarily integrated into the buyer? And how does that kind of change the process or the timing for the integration team or other issues?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question, Mike. I have seen that. I think it's that's a real thing where if you're buying a company maybe that has its very own distinct brand and distinct culture, and more so than worrying about what's the buyer's new culture going to be, it's more about we do want to retain our culture because we've been cultivating it for years, and it's important to us. And if it's even for the acquirer, it could be very important for the brand going forward. Of course, that to customers, it's important to customers feel more comfortable with the target brand, and they don't want to see it subsumed necessarily into some future larger brand. I think it's absolutely doable, and it's more just about keeping a bit of a hands-off approach. Obviously, there are some aspects of the business where you need to be connected, and still maintaining a bit of a standalone situation. We have a company called Vermont Creamery that is a very distinct brand, and they're a B Corp, and they've got some other some very unique aspects. And I think we've done a good job of allowing it to keep a lot of the things that made it distinct.
All right, so I want to switch topics a bit to legal issues that can arise after closing, and I want to start with the last point here, which is who owns this one. I find that you had an example of where you owned everything up to the day of closing as an outside lawyer, then closed, and then you owned it afterwards as well. It was a great example of the old adage that when you point a finger, three are pointing back at you. So, but in any event, once the deal closes, my experience at least has been that everybody who's involved is just exhausted. You've been working 15-hour days for weeks or months, and getting all this information, and there's every detail out there, et cetera. And then people take a break, but I kind of call it the D-Day +1 problem. They stormed the beaches and were successful, but the next day they needed gasoline and toilet paper and food and everything that you need, and so who owns that part?
Yeah, and you're right, Mike. Especially on the outside counsel end of things, you're kind of taking a half day to rest easy, breathe, do some breathing, and hopefully you've already prepared that post-closing checklist for the client, and you shift your focus to something else. In-house here, similar, oftentimes where I'm having much less involvement with any particular target once the deal has closed, but we've kind of actually been trying to institute a little bit more involvement from the legal, especially, there's the business unit attorney and they're involved, they kind of take it over. So I'm kind of handing it over to the business unit attorney. We're trying to stay a little bit more involved just because, there are oftentimes obligations or rights that are arising post-closing. And some of these things we've mentioned as well before about what are some of the deal assumptions from day one that need to be carried through, and who should be owning that. And certainly kind of my M&A team, my little M&A team of a few people can have some ownership over that. So we're, utilizing those post-closing checklists and tracking. We kind of try to do this post-closing tracker with calendaring and such to at least, we're not going to own the whole thing because now it's on the business, and even the BD team is mostly done with it as well. Although, like I said, we have plenty of situations with multiple closings where the deals don't go away.
I remember years ago learning a trick for any speech I went to. I would bring 2 pads of paper, one to take notes on about the topic, and the other to take notes on about what I was going to do about it. My own kind of personal checklist. And I think one really good tip for those involved in a transaction on both sides of the buy or sell is to start early with your list of post closing integration topics from the very get-go of what the value is that makes this deal so compelling, and write that down somewhere. And then as issues come up, you can kind of delegate it to the paper and begin creating your checklist that should be evolved rather than created on the day of closing, or God forbid afterwards, right?
Absolutely.
So John asked an interesting question about transition services agreements. His question is particular to the food and agriculture sector, but I know that in some situations there is the integration doesn't happen on day one, and the closing doesn't happen in a day one. You actually described the 2 closing process. Can you talk a little bit about what a 2 closing process is, and then maybe in the context of that, what a transition services agreement might be and how that could work?
Sure. On the transition services agreement side, I think, as I was mentioning, in the strategic acquisition side, where we're doing a lot of carve-outs of a business, transition services are fairly standard, where we need support from the selling entity if you're carving out part of the business, and we can't take an entire enterprise infrastructure that the seller has. And we need to get those transitionary services. We see it oftentimes on the IT side, where the acquirer needs to utilize some IT, the benefit of some IT contract for a while until the buyer can set up its own IT. So it's kind of up, in all the various kind of aspects of the deal, and it's important. That's a good part of the integration to keep an eye on. Here are things we've identified in the diligence and in the integration that day one we're not going to be able to do, and we need to get those from the seller, and that's where that happens. And it's one of the transition services agreement. Good point from John. That's one of the important tools in the integration tool belt.
It could give you a little bit of breathing room, I guess, to identify and tie up those loose ends that you described.
Right. And depending, sometimes there's some friction and tension depending on the buyer and seller and the relationship of how long are we going to provide those transition services agreements, how much are they going to cost, and if they're, the cost of the transition services agreement should be looked at in terms of the overall valuation of the deal, and is that going to hamstring the project in year 1 or 2 because of the increased costs of the transition services
that weren't taken into account early on, right?
Right. So you have to price those in and negotiate that.
Yeah, you also list on the legal milestones, before we leave this slide, 2 topics that I hear about a lot in the early stages, and then people seem to be, like, I don't know, forget about it, but it's, the ideas of earnouts and equity rollover. Can you talk about what those are and how you approach them post-closing?
Sure. The earnout just refers to a portion of the consideration being made contingent on achieving certain, typically business targets. We've seen all manner of earnout, sometimes tied to revenue, sometimes tied to retention of certain customers, or tied to getting even like an FDA approval for a product, which of course would be more on the healthcare side. We've had earnouts tied to sale of specific seed volume and things like that. So it's really about, okay, seller, you're telling us the business is going to be worth X. well, we don't quite believe that, but if it gets there, then we'll pay you more for this business. And that can be absolutely a mixed bag. And I always try to look askance at the earnout to determine, do we really need to offer the earnout to get this deal? And folks probably remember different M&A markets when earnouts were, I think, a lot more common. And it might just be that buyers and sellers have both kind of been burned enough that you just try to do it in the pricing up front as opposed to the earnout. But they're still done, of course, and can be some of the trickiest in that post-closing period, just in terms of, what is the business doing to meet the earnout? Are some of the seller parties still involved? Is management still involved? Anybody that's still helping to run the business that is looking, that's incentivized by these earnouts.
Wait, you mean I still have to work here after I get all this money?
If you want to get more money, Mike. So it's, just fraught. There are conflicts, and there, can be easily be disputes about whether the milestone was reached. And, further to the sub-bullet here about changing circumstances, it might be in the interest of the business to change something about the way it goes to market that could compromise the earnout. And even though it might be better overall, of course, there are issues of even if the parties who had received the earnout are no longer involved, there might be some covenants, post-closing covenants, about how to run the business to make sure to hit the earnouts. And so there's too many, to me, that too many contingencies, and too much can happen in the out years.
I'll give a final example on earnouts. That we had a transaction recently where one of the key people, it was a traditional company buying a software company, and they really needed some key people to stick around, and so they had an earnout as part of that. But one of the key people said, I'm just done, and walked away maybe a month later. And they said, well, but you're leaving all this money on the table. And the gentleman said, yeah, okay, sounds good. And he was done, never working again. So briefly, we've got some issues on the international side, which is, I would say, amplifies, right, Matt, all the things that we've talked about so far. That, administrative timing, I mentioned earlier, the customs issues, which can be significant, employee deal consequences, and terminations abroad, often very, very different and much more difficult to affect. Layoffs carry significant cost penalties and such. So it's just really important, if you have an international deal, to have that be a topic, early and often, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think that's the takeaway on the international, is that domestically, you have a feel for how things go, but you can't make any assumptions about a given jurisdiction. I have a good example about hitting a competition speed trap in Poland on a deal where we didn't, neither us nor the other party had any activity in Poland, but Poland's got a speed trap competition law that's going to require you to file for competition approval there. And so that slows things down and involves, the typical huge data compilation that they need to see. So it's always, I think that's the key there, Mike, is just validate all the various aspects of the transaction. I mean, we've had deals where it's been very difficult to move intellectual property between affiliates, because they're moving across jurisdictional lines, and the subject jurisdiction has tried to keep IP in its jurisdiction, and so all kinds of complications that are literally foreign to us here in the States.
And I would say getting local counsel is critical, and sometimes very local, in the city or county that you're, at issue. Example in Poland. Someone in the EU is not necessarily going to be fluent in the Polish law issues that are unique to that transaction and such. Yeah. And then we had some slides on breaking up is hard to do, more, I think, perhaps on issue spotting side. As people are kind of reading through these topics, you'd mentioned the dual close, and and a fairly extended, it sounded like, bifurcation. What is that dual close, and how might that complicate breaking up of a deal or integration of it?
I mean, right. A lot of different reasons for doing a dual close. We've had to do dual closes because of non-competes, either on our side or on the other side, that you're waiting for those to expire before a certain business comes over, or we've done deals where we've held back some intellectual property assets until certain deal triggers occurred. And those can be for a short period of time, or they can be for years. And as we said before, the changing circumstances can really complicate that second closing, because you've got a deal agreement that was written years before. And so I think the bottom line under this one is, as we say here, keep a version of the integration team in place. Try to, you're not having bi-weekly calls for 3 years, obviously, but if you can, have a good post-closing checklist, integrate that business into the business checklist. Try to keep some kind of, you'll have like a quasi almost advisory board for the subject business as well, that's kind of keeping all sides involved. So some version of, don't lose track of where the pieces are on the board over the course of a long interim period.
And I would think that it increases the risk of, on the business side, saying, well, wait a minute, this isn't as good a deal as I thought it was going to be. And hey, lawyer, can you find a way, that kind of a thing.
Precisely.
All right. So as we wrap up then, I always ask for 5 takeaways, meaning what are the 5 things that the people listening can do right now to help improve their company, improve their business, or in this example, improve the effectiveness of integration and capturing of the value that they were hoping for in the transaction. So you had a 5 plus a bonus takeaway, which I loved. So can you briefly describe these for the participants?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you've likely picked up here, the checklists, I think, are the key tool, and like as underlined, the business checklist as well. If you can get your business to put their planning in a checklist and keep both of those handy and updated. The second one here is a good thing to keep in mind, as we mentioned, start integration as early as possible. But the flip side of that is making sure to keep an eye on anti-competition or antitrust gun jumping issues. Watch the competitively sensitive information until it's appropriate to share, and try to do as much as you can without crossing that line, and be aggressive with the timelines. Third here, take some time early on just as yourself, as the counsel on the transaction. These deals are very complex. Try to look from supply chain to customer and think about all aspects of the business that you're acquiring and the business you're latching it onto, and talk with folks in the business and try to gather information. Internationally, as we said here, you can't make assumptions about that you're going to be able to file merger papers in Hong Kong that will be ready that day. We're used to that with Delaware. That's not the case all over the world, of course. Fifth, over communicate. I think that's the perfect word for how I would go about it, especially in the Zoom world that we're still in. It's hard to just run over and talk to somebody. So either set up the frequent calls, pick up phones, and then sixth, it can take a while. It's a long process. Grind it out. Pass this prologue, as they say, which is to say, in the early stages of the deal, we're setting the stage for what's going to happen post-closing, and all the planning that is done. We're going to have deal fatigue, et cetera, but you're setting the stage for the business success.
And I would put in that final one, set actual personal milestones. 6 months in, this is where we want to be a year in. We're going to have a birthday party. It's going to be the first birthday of this transaction or whatever. And so having those kind of milestones is really critical. So Terrific. Well, a couple of things as we close out. First, again, a reminder, if you'd like more CLE credit, you should complete the sign-in sheet, which was included in yesterday's reminder email. You send that in to Michelle Hubble, who then coordinates the CLE certificates and the like. For those interested in particular in cooperative law and merger and acquisition issues in co-ops, we have a book called Cooperative Business Law. It's now available on Amazon. Very cool. And so I commend that to you. And then finally, Matt was very gracious in saying that he would, I'm not sure if welcome's the right word, but definitely be available to folks for questions following this presentation on some of the practical tips that come up in this very important area. And so we will, we've taped this program. It'll be available online, not for CLE credit, but otherwise available. If you'd like to send it to other members of your team, you're welcome to do that once it's up. And we also have the other two presentations as well on this three-part series. So with that, Matt, thank you so much. I've learned a ton and really appreciate your guidance and input.
My pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
All right, terrific. Thanks everybody for attending.